President Donald Trump is making a statement in his second term, citing dozens of executive orders less than a month into his term.
WIFR news reporter Anthony Freddy talks with a political expert on the constitutionality of these orders.
Trump has signed more than 5 dozen executive orders since taking the oath of office about 3 weeks ago. To put that into perspective, former President Biden signed about 13 dozen during his entire term.
I don't think any president in his first 2 or 3 weeks has issued anything like this number of executive orders.
From renaming the Gulf of Mexico to bringing back plastic straws, President Trump signing executive orders at an unprecedented pace.
There is no more fragile way for presidents to govern than executive order.
But experts say lawsuits can arise if the president is legislating the law instead of issuing orders on how to execute the law.
The current administration believes that he was elected king, and he's not.
Political professor Bob Evans says people may not react to orders involving less talked about agencies like U.S. aid, but things could get difficult if Trump issues orders on Medicaid or education.
Then you'll see how deep his support is. People don't want the education of their children messed with.
Area attorney Chris Durango says each federal agency has an inspector general to make sure it's following the rules. Trump fired more than a dozen just days into office. He fired U.S. aides Tuesday.
You don't do that because you intend to follow the rules.
Durango says the Supreme Court doesn't have its own army to enforce these rulings and says someone needs to hold the commander-in-chief accountable.
Will the executive branch enforce those rulings if the members of the current administration decide not to follow those things? I don't know, and I'm not sure what will happen if that time comes.
Durango says if lawsuits are carried out, we could see them in the Supreme Court in 12 to 18 months, including one issued Tuesday alleging the end of U.S. aid means millions of dollars in unpaid bills for businesses.
Thank you, Anthony. And Evans says the congressional elections in 2026 will be telling for this administration because the party winning the White House tends to lose some House and Senate seats at the midterm.